Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Barnett. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And my research and practice relates to public health emergency preparedness. And I'm going to present here some very important but essential information for households and individuals regarding personal and family disaster preparedness. We are currently, at the time of this recording, living through COVID-19. And these issues that we'll be talking about today have really incredible resonance and importance as we think about dealing with the current pandemic, as well as additional threats that we may encounter in the months to years ahead. So all of these are intended to be very practical and basic guidelines. There are some thought questions that are important to consider. And I'd encourage you to just spend a few minutes thinking about these because they'll inform your planning and readiness for your household and yourself. The first is, what emergencies have you dealt with or been affected by? I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has affected us all in one way or another. But there are other events that may have affected you, perhaps weather-related disasters or other kinds of situations. When you think about these important considerations, think about how these affected you, both personally and professionally. Those kinds of thoughts can help motivate and provide insights into the things that you'll need to do to prepare yourselves and your families for disasters. So let's also think about other considerations. Do you have children or family members or elderly dependents who live with you or depend on you for your care? Do you have pets? These questions are really important because they will shape your personal and family preparedness planning. There are a large variety and an increasing number of disaster types that we are encountering in the US and worldwide. And a bit of a thought question is, which of these is the most common natural disaster in the US? The answer is actually flooding. Whether we have a hurricane event or other storm surge event, flooding is the most common type of natural disaster. We also have to think about intentional disasters and industrial disasters, so ranging from terrorism to industrial accidents and the like. So all of these are important to consider when we think about personal and family preparedness. The good news is that the essentials of personal and family preparedness are relevant in many ways to a whole range of disaster categories. There are three critical elements to preparedness, and these are consistent with ready.gov, which is from the federal government. And the first step is to get a kit. The next step is to make a plan, and the third step is to be informed. We'll address each of these in turn. So let's first begin with a discussion briefly of what it means to get a kit. It's important to think in categories. For example, what do I need for sustenance? Thinking about the basics: food, water, shelter. What might you need if you have to evacuate? In recent, several days ago, for example, there was a large-scale evacuation on the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Laura, and that's in the middle of a pandemic. So we need to think about these considerations, not just for a natural weather disaster, but overlapping a pandemic. What do I need to communicate? What would I need for entertainment for children, for example, who are my dependents if I have to shelter in place for several days? Or in the case of COVID-19, if I have to quarantine for several days. These are all important considerations when we think about personal and family preparedness. One of the key rules of thumb is 1 gallon of water per person per day for drinking and sanitizing. There may be additional water needs beyond that. Now, I'm not encouraging people to go out and get massive jugs of bottled water, but even tap water, assuming the water is safe to drink, that is perfectly fine. And there are also other options that are accessible on websites such as the American Red Cross for purifying water as needed. But this ratio of 1 gallon of water per person per day means that if you have a household of 3 people and you're thinking, and we think about the importance of needing at least a 3-day supply, as on this slide. So if you have a household of 3 people, 3 gallons per person per day, that's 9 gallons of water over 3 days. And of course, pets need hydration too. So this is a very important aspect. With regard to food, we think about items that require little, or actually ideally no refrigeration, or little preparation or cooking. So this is a list that you can refer to of things that could be very easily stored. We want to avoid salty foods because they'll only make you thirsty. And so we want to just try to make a sort of an essentials food supply kit that will last you for at least 3 days, or in the case of COVID-19, if you're quarantining, up to 2 weeks. So these are very relevant to personal and family preparedness. On this list, which I won't read each item, there are a lot of relevant items to include. A first aid kit, for example, is on this list. Pet food and extra water if you have a pet. Blankets, you know, we always assume in disasters that the electricity goes out. So we want to think about if an event were to happen in the wintertime, what would be the implications in terms of keeping warm in personal and family preparedness. So let's talk a little more about where to store your kit. It should be in a place that's known to all your family members. It should not be difficult to access. It should be something that you can transport. So obviously, we're not talking about a massive luggage size or other container, but something that you can transport relatively easily. You'd be required to evacuate. As I mentioned earlier, there was an evacuation event involving a Gulf Coast hurricane several days ago with Hurricane Laura. So let's talk a little more about the next step, which is to make a plan. So we've talked about getting a kit. Let's talk about what it means to make a plan. Think about what would happen if your daily routine were disrupted by an unforeseen event. And remember, your family may not be together when a disaster occurs. Even thinking back to September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center occurred at the beginning of a business day. So not factoring in COVID-19, when a lot of children obviously are doing school from home, but thinking about what would happen if you were at work and your family is separated at the time. How would you make sure that your plan includes an approach to make sure your family can get together, can communicate with each other? And so all of these things are really critical as part of making a plan, and communication with family members and other loved ones is really critical as part of that plan. So that includes identifying an out-of-town contact. It may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but if a weather disaster were to occur, let's say in Baltimore, and that weather disaster were not affecting, let's just say, Philadelphia, it actually may be easier to call out from Baltimore to Philadelphia to let a personal contact of yours in Philadelphia know that you're okay. Because typically cell phone and landlines even can be tied up locally. So it can actually paradoxically be easier to call out of state to let others know that you're okay. And then that person, for example, in the Philadelphia example, can call others through a phone tree to let everyone else know that you're okay. So you have to place just one call, and that leads to a cascade of calls that another relative or point of contact can initiate. It's important to teach family members to use text messaging. There's SMS systems for alerts. And I encourage you, if possible, to subscribe to emergency alert services in your state or community. It's very important to be what we call situationally aware of what's going on. And the best way to be situationally aware is to, if possible, subscribe to such services. Also important to think about creating multiple plans. You may need different plans for different scenarios. I mentioned earlier that the basic context of what we're planning for is often the same based on different disaster types, but there are variations. What if you had to stay sheltered in place for a long period of time? What if you needed to evacuate? So make sure that your family members have phones and phone access to make emergency calls. Make sure to, if you have children, to give them a card with emergency contact information. There's a FEMA for Kids website that's quite excellent. And there are a lot of great resources that I would encourage you to look at in that regard. What else is needed for your plan? Think about caring for your pets. So I would encourage you to discuss with your veterinarian, what are your pets' needs if a disaster were to occur? And have that as part of your overall emergency plan. If you have family members with special needs, what are their specific needs that may come into play in disasters? That's also important for tailoring your plan accordingly. There are school emergency plans, even apart from COVID-19, that are important to think about what would happen if a weather disaster, for example, were to occur that could affect a school building. So we have to think about schools too. And reviewing and practicing plans is critically important. So this doesn't mean having a fire drill every week in your home or anything like that, but it does mean periodically reviewing your plan that you have for your personal and family household plan and going over it with your children and practicing it. And that's important because for two reasons. First of all, it makes sure that you're fresh and up to speed with your own plan, but it also is important for children to communicate with them in a very sensitive way that this is going to help make them safer in disasters. So there are a variety of benefits to doing practice activities to hone your personal and family preparedness plan. The last part of the federal guidance on personal and family preparedness is to be informed. Generally, for a given jurisdiction, there's one radio station, for example, of choice that is the most connected to emergency authorities. In Baltimore, historically, it has been WBAL AM 1090, for example. So it's important to know which radio station is the most connected to sort of emergency outlets. And that's something that you can identify for your own respective jurisdiction. So it's important to seek information about a variety of emergencies that your family could experience. This could include everything from a house fire to flooding or a medical emergency to something at a larger scale level, such as a weather-related disaster. So we have to think about a whole broad range of events that your jurisdiction or community has experienced or may experience in the context of getting you ready for your personal and family preparedness planning. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's important to know what information sources to seek during an emergency. Again, we typically assume that the power is out in an emergency. That should be your default assumption. AM radio, and if you have, for example, a crank radio, that's a very good use of technology to ensure that you have information access. So AM radio and the station that's most connected directly to emergency management agencies in your area is critical. So I mentioned, for example, WBAL 1090 as an example in the Baltimore city area. So it's important to know what those stations are in advance so that you can tune into them accordingly during a disaster. And last but not least, there are a whole host of excellent preparedness resources at the local, state, and federal level that can provide valuable additional insights into what needs to go into a kit, what needs to go into making a plan, and what needs to go in to be informed. So with that, I hope this has been a helpful introductory overview for the really key essential elements of being personally and household prepared for a whole array of events as we think about keeping ourselves and our communities safe. Thank you very much.